I'm Bianca Bosker, as the voice just said, and this is Denisa Livingston. I will let you also introduce yourself.
Okay. Yat'e, that means all is well in Diné, in the Navajo Nation. Yat'e, she'e Denisa Livingston, and she'e kitachini, and she'e Diné, abashashin, oze Diné, tachini, dashache, do, nanish edge tachini, dashanella. T'aya sedent, nasha, e tedagon, wolye, diagot adi, nishila. I introduce myself in my language in Diné. I am from the Navajo Nation, from the Four Corners area. I'm from the Red House People Clan, and really excited to be here in your concrete jungle. So I hope I bring a little bit of wilderness to your area, and I really identify myself as an ancestor. That is something that's very critical, and we'll talk about that in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So Denisa, as you alluded to, has worked with the Diné Community Advocacy Alliance. And her work, there, of course, is bios floating around here. You all are familiar with Google, I'm sure. But
Grandma Google. Grandma Google.
Yeah, right. And she has worked to fight food deserts, diabetes, and other issues in Navajo communities. And she's done this by empowering local community members to take control of food policy and also to promote local health initiatives. And just to offer some kind of context for the conversation we're going to have, I think it's interesting to note that 99% of the Navajo Nation is a food desert. And a third of the Navajo population is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And so some of the efforts that you have led is, for example, eliminating a tax on healthy foods, which did exist. I remember we were talking about this, and that was pretty appalling. And actually instituting the first, and I believe still only, is that right, tax on junk food. So I want to start by actually talking about what you see as the most pressing issues and problems in relation to food in the Navajo Nation, and also, if you want to talk about it more generally, with indigenous peoples and communities.
One of the biggest challenges for us, and like you had mentioned, the word food desert, right? Years back, we used to refer to this word, and the USDA identified that the Navajo Nation was a 99% food desert. But now we're moving to not using that term, because we know that a desert is an ecosystem. It's full of life. And so it's food apartheid, that we should be talking about. And so for us on the Navajo Nation and many indigenous communities all around the world, the biggest thing that we're facing in relation to history and calling out history, addressing history, is that for us as Diné people, the U.S. government has sent our people to a concentration camp in the 1850s, and there we were removed from our land. Our people walked over 500 miles to Bosque Redondo, which is in southern New Mexico, and there they removed us from our land, took our food, took everything, all the lifeways, the foodways from our people. And when our people returned back, when the treaty was signed of 1864, that was something that we returned back with salt, sugar, and flour and canned foods. And to this day, where I live, if any of you have ever been, to Arizona, New Mexico, the Utah area, we have nothing but unhealthy food. We have nothing but junk food, and this food that never existed in our diet. It never even existed in our language. So when we were writing the unhealthy foods tax, known as the Healthy Diné Nation Act, we wanted to put a taxation on unhealthy food, and this was something that many folks weren't familiar with, was taxation. I know Forbes, called out, that the Navajo Nation has one of the highest taxes in the U.S. We have taxation up to 13% or even higher with the Navajo Nation tax, with the sales tax, the unhealthy foods tax, in addition to the township taxes. And so when we're still addressing the salt, the sugar, and the flour, and the canned foods that still exist in our diet to this day, that we have about 1% to 2% access to healthy food, it's really stripping that identity, because food is something that is holy to us. Food is something that is holy. It's our identity. When you strip that identity, then how are we supposed to have agency? How are we supposed to have the power, the food that makes us powerful, the food that is medicine, the food that is healing to us? And so in our language, we didn't have the word junk food. And I always say that there's junk and there's food. There's no such thing as junk food. So, for us, we say unhealthy food, the unhealthy food sack. Well, in Diné, our language, ch'iyan bijol. Ch'iyan means food, but bijol means the prison food, the contaminated food, the fast casual food, the unhealthy food, the non-nutritious food, the food, that should not exist in our food system. That's what that word means. It's a very spiritual aspect, to our language. And this is the year of the UN Indigenous Languages. Like, when we talk about ch'iyan bijol, it gives me the chills because it should not even exist in our diet, in our food system. And so one of the other things is ch'iyan yahat ek, on the other hand, is, the wholesome food. When I greeted you, I said yahat e, which means everything is well, everything is whole. That's the food that we're trying to focus on, and I believe you're here for that. Ch'iyan yahat eki is the healthy, wholesome food.
So Denisa actually brought copies for all of you of a newsletter that she has worked on called Let's Live a Long Life, and there'll be copies available as you exit. I encourage you all to take one as you go. And in that, we were looking at it earlier, and there's it shows as kind of many of the efforts that you've worked on to try and kind of reduce the food contamination, to reacquaint people with their own kind of traditions and foods. Can you talk more about that, about the importance of doing that and also how you've done that?
So one of the biggest things I think, here, first and foremost, to answer that question is, the land acknowledgement. I don't know if at the start of this event that an Indigenous person acknowledges land and the people invited you to be in this space. This is very important as we look at our work, looking at, how do we make improvements, is acknowledging the Indigenous people of this land, acknowledging, the ancestors and also the caretakers of this. But as we're addressing our food system and as we're moving forward, we're talking about all those critical partnerships, and we're talking about allyship. And what does that mean? How do we ally with each other? How do we find relationships? So when I introduced myself and Diné at the beginning, in our cultural practice, we introduce ourselves to make that relation. So knowing that if you are the same clan as myself, to know that you're my sister or my aunt, or to know that somebody's an uncle or a brother, everything is relational. In Diné, we have our cultural practice, and it is something very special to us. It's called K'e, which means that everything is relational, that the work we're doing, the future, and also the role that I lead as an ancestor, that, that before we used to look back and say, oh, I'm a descendant of my ancestor, I'm, this individual, but now we need to look forward, step into that participatory role and say, that I'm the ancestor, because we need to learn how to be a good relative. Every decision that we make, every conference that we go to, every event, when we move and move with integrity, when we scale with integrity, then we know that we're making that ethical shift to acknowledge even the Indigenous people. It is so important, very important. And as we're addressing climate change, Indigenous people are now at the center of the conversation because we hold that knowledge, not only for food system, but also because we relate to our animal and plant relatives, that everything is relational. And so as we're moving towards this and talking about allyships and what we're doing, Indigenous people, we're convening. And most of the time, we're convening underground as well, because, the knowledge and the ancestral knowledge, the ancestral justice, the wisdom that lays, within our communities, that many places are oral traditions. We hold this knowledge and wisdom that cannot be accessed through academia. We have to talk to grandma. We have to talk to the youth. We have to do intergenerational work, that's going to allow, the vibrancy to come out, to be more creative, to be solution drivers, to be design thinkers. And this is, as Indigenous people, this is where I'm coming from, and this is the work that I've been able to lead, especially with the only unhealthy food sacks in the U.S. At the end of 2017, we had raised over $4.5 million on Navajo, and we have funded over 1,000 health initiatives. And this is very critical because do we see this in the media? Is this something that is being followed? Is this something that is being featured? Most of the time, even with that, the authorship and the ownership of Indigenous people, we're being spoken on behalf of, right? We're not given the mic and saying, you tell your own story, And this is very important, for us, to realize that we need to be telling stories to one another in person, in relationship with one another, so that we know that we can scale with integrity. So many moving parts to the aspect of, what we're doing. doing. But one of the more critical thing is that we're doing a lot of taste education. The organization that I lead, Diné Community Advocacy Alliance, it is, a place, where we do a lot of taste ed. When we come together, we have the elders, we have the youth, and we're exploring the future of food. But it's really, our ancestors' foods, insects, roots, fermentation, wild foods, endangered foods, heirloom foods, and learning about them, learning how to taste it, learning how to cook it, learning how to prepare it, learning how to grow it, and learning how to harvest it. It's very important, when we're talking about, this food tank and how do we create solutions. So many aspects to that.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. There's a story in the newsletter about your grandmother, right? And these amazing drawings of foods that she is familiar with, but it sounds like your mother even wasn't as familiar with.
Right.
And so bringing those back in and sharing that knowledge. I think that also raises an interesting question of, the kind of the risk, of course, of like the superfood phenomenon, right? Of then taking this knowledge and maybe commercializing it or appropriating it. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, are we at that point yet that this is something that you're, thinking about or actively working to avoid? Like, what does the future of that kind of look like?
Yeah, I think even in the situation, the environment, the climate change that we're in, that we leave the spirituality part out. We tend to put that aside, or that's a political thing, or that's something that divides us. But really, the spiritual aspect of what we're doing is so very important. When we're looking at plant-based organizations, a plant doesn't have a brain. So how does a plant survive? Our prophecies, one of our stories, our creation stories, is that that there would be a web around the world one day. And what do we see? The World Wide Web, right? And the World Wide Web is a place, that the systems support one another. We're not looking at a hierarchical aspect. We're looking at a plant-based aspect. We're looking at the spiritual aspect, because the connection is not from what I decide what I want to do today, is what has actually been given. We've inherited, the blood, the sweat, the tears of our ancestors, but we've also inherited their dreams. We've also inherited, their visions of what we should be carrying forward. So we tend to leave that out. And how are we connecting to that, and how are we moving forward to it? And so for my grandma, the story in the newsletter that you can receive on your way out, my grandmother drew a picture about 2 years ago, and she showed me this picture, and I said, Grandma, what are these, what is this picture? And I had no idea, and she drew some foods there, and one of those foods was nano yeshe, and in Diné, in Navajo, we have this food that we've never even seen, that my mother has never even seen. And she said, this is nano yeshe, and it's blue cornmeal with goat's milk poured over steeping coals, hot coals, without any utensils, without anything, used. And are we seeing those practices? Are we seeing these types of, cooking methods, that are not found in cookbooks or even at cooking schools? And the critical thing here is that, why should my grandma have to wait 90 years to share something? Are we creating moments of healing? Are we creating opportunities of healing? Are we creating environments and events of healing and joy and justice? And that really made me cry, because how many people here, you should leave this place and go home and start, finding those stories. The biggest question, that you ask is, people ask oh, we want to know about indigenous foods. We want to know about, indigenous ways. Well, we want to know about what your first ways are. Go back and learn about what your first foods were. Go back and learn about, where you come from, because every one of us here have roots. It is so important. The very critical thing is that we're not going to be commercializing, our ways. We're not going to be commercializing our foods. It's very important. That's the reason when I speak on behalf of allyship, that, we have to talk about the relationship. We have to talk about how do we ally, how do we partner, because that's the essential oil. It's people say oh, the superfood. Well, we need that essential oil as, relationship aspect and relationship driving, learning how to do that. People think there's that we're not human beings, right? That indigenous people no longer exist, but # we're still here. And, it's like... And so as we ally together, it's making a friendship, it's making that relationship, talking to one another, taking one another out to lunch, to dinner, not just sending an email, not just sending a text message or a phone call and say, I would like to connect with you. Okay, let's have lunch first. Let's go, and have some, times, where we are human beings together. This is the very critical matter, when we're talking about, commercializing or appropriation. Let's think about, the rights of just being a human being. Let's really, look at the posture of our heart and look at the posture of our work, and how we move forward in that.
Yeah, so I see this very aggressive clock ticking down. It's very intimidating from this perspective. Feels like a bomb is going off somewhere. So I know we have very little time, but very quickly, what can people do to get involved, to support your work? Give us some resources and homework, please.
Lots of homework, but one of the critical things, because of the time is clicking, I think even the chronos, right, that time, and also the kairos, about when things should happen is the right time. When things are over, it's over. Respecting that spiritual aspect of time and as the way that we function, the way that we organize as community organizers, our climate change should be better at organizing. We should be, if industries and corporations are speaking to the bellies of food, of unhealthy food, they're feeding us this, we should be speaking to the dreams of people. We should be activating that. We have to be those dream activators. And so your homework is to read 3 books. Our newly released book anthology is Food Sovereignty in the U.S. You can find that at the University of Oklahoma or even on Amazon, as well as The Sous Chef, who is by the chef Sean Sherman, just won the James Beard Award, and then also the Pueblo Food Experience, and then also visiting native-land.ca and see whose land you're on, and recognize those tribes and start creating those protocols, and as well as getting our newsletter, connecting with us on social media. Follow us on the Indigenous Terra Madre at Slow Food International. We have an international organization uniting Indigenous people worldwide in food tasting and all of those great things, and advocating for our wild foods and our heirloom foods and endangered foods. So lots of homework.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned also before being sure and conscious of including Indigenous people in events and in spaces like these, right?
Right. And it's very critical, but please, learn that word, iyan yahat egi and iyan bajol, which is unhealthy and also healthy and unhealthy food, but also the biggest thing, Let's Live a Long Life, the newsletter in Navajo, Let's Live a Long Life is Shana Daneglingo As Atnel Deto. As difficult as it is to implement, it's just as difficult to say. So that's our work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here, for holding space for us.
You.
And thank you so much, Denisa. Round of applause. Thank you.